they bonded even in the 9 months that he was at this one last school. And she goes, you're pretty smart and your test scores are really good, especially since you never go to school. I think we can do better for you. I think we can get you to college. This is a kid who was like dropped out of 3 high schools, right? Well, okay. About a month ago, I watched Jay earn his doctorate. He is now a PhD. And he pegs the turnaround to that moment with her, this 23-year-old graduation advocate at his last chance high school. This is the power of connection. This is the power of a human connection that can make a difference for people. That tugs at my heartstrings.
Hello, and welcome to the Stay Free Forever podcast, episode 18. My name is Clifford Fuel, host of the podcast that aims to help you adapt and thrive. If all goes well, today you are going to have some of your long-held beliefs challenged, as mine were this past week when I read a new book about foster care in the United States. For example, one of my long-held beliefs is children are so resilient, based on my experience of seeing my own kids endure separation, loss, and divorce, and still turn out to be okay. After reading Wards of the State, The Long Shadow of American Foster Care, I am more inclined now to agree with the book's author, Claudia Rowe, when she writes, adults often marvel at the resilience of children, but based on what I've seen, a more apt description would paint them as survivalists, hanging on. What Claudia Rowe has seen and shares with the reader in crisp, accessible detail is the dark underbelly of the $31.4 billion per year foster care industry that systematically connects and then disconnects children with a dizzying succession of foster families, group homes, case managers, public defenders, judges, and more. In the process, tender psyches are irrevocably torn, and youthful potential is derailed into incarceration at a rate that would be hard to believe were it not so meticulously documented by Ms. Rowe, who is my guest today. The way Claudia unravels the story of this well-intended idea gone wrong is through the individual stories of a dozen or so people who have been foster kids, or foster parents, or professionals charged with managing these journeys. In her introduction, she writes, quote, "The question why hovers over every piece of writing I've ever done. Dissecting a person's motivation, especially for acts that appear incomprehensible, drew me into journalism and has powered my work for decades. Why had that man done this horrible thing? Why was this girl that way? What was in their heads? How did they understand themselves? These mysteries were rolling around the back of my mind on a February morning in 2019 as I watched a pale 19-year-old girl escorted into a Seattle courtroom to be sentenced for murder." From her first job as a reporter in the early 1990s, Claudia has been writing about kids in trouble. She says her editor at her first paper told her, "You want to understand why people do the things they do? Look in the schools." Claudia began covering crime and then public education in the Bronx, New York. Her education reporting eventually led her to looking at juvenile justice, which pointed her toward looking at kids growing up in struggling homes, which brought her straight to the child welfare system. "It's all of a piece," she says. "Wards of the State is the culmination of 34 years of reporting on the places where young people and government intersect or clash. Today, we're going to look at that clash and see what hope remains for an entrenched system that has gotten it wrong for too many for too long." Welcome to the Stay Free Forever podcast, Claudia Rowe.
Thank you so much for having me. What a fantastic intro. Thanks, Cliff.
Thank you. And this is a problem that we didn't know we had until you put this big spotlight on it. I wanted to start by asking you, when you first had the idea for a book on teen crime that morphed into one on the long shadow of foster care in the US, what audience did you have in mind, and did that audience change in your mind as you began to research and write?
I think the audience I had in mind has remained relatively consistent through the process, though thinking about the audience I had in mind from the start would be a general reader, somebody not part of the child welfare system, not a so-called practitioner,
Yeah.
not saying I don't want those people to read the book. Of course I do. And they are in my mind as I'm writing to make sure it's representative, accurate. I certainly am thinking about as much as I can about the experience of people in the system while I'm writing about really the experience of kids in the system. The original concept of the book was to try to explain to a general reader the emotional or psychological reality through the kid's eyes of being an older youth in foster care, which often means being on the run, being in a group home, being on the street in some way. I mean, that's almost part and parcel of being an older youth in foster care for a lot of kids. So always a general reader without deep knowledge of foster care, but maybe some vague familiarity. And then while writing, thinking about those who work within the system and trying to be as faithful to something they would recognize too.
Thank you. Yeah. So I'll confess my audience, the group that I hope to be reaching is people who are in trouble with the law, trying to avoid going to prison, trying to avoid going back to prison, trying to get over their addiction. Given how slowly systemic change is likely to take in this area that you've exposed so well, armed with their own copies of Wards of the State, how could teen foster kids today better advocate for themselves?
It's a great question. First of all, I would say that the topic of like youth voice, youth agency, so
Yes.
young people advocating for themselves, and youth voice was very much in my mind as I started this thing about through their eyes, like I just mentioned, that I really wanted the youth voice as much as possible. That is happening sort of across the field. All kinds of advocacy groups where young people's voices are being elevated. This is kind of a double-edged sword, though. And I talk about this in the book, really through two characters, and the issue of young people in foster care who are being sought out more and more to speak for advocacy organizations. And yet, when they are no longer so young, when they cross the line of, you're 30 now and older, suddenly you're not useful anymore. And this is a really, really harsh, kind of brusque reality check for a lot of young people who are in foster care and who have, one of the characters in the book, Sixto, and I call them characters even though they are in fact real people,
Sure.
but Sixto Cancel is an activist who works at the federal policy level now, trying to improve foster care specifically for older youth. And so he is a former foster youth who grew up in Bridgeport, Connecticut, which
Yes.
is a very tough town. People hear Connecticut and they think, oh, country clubs, but Bridgeport
No.
is not that. Bridgeport is a tough town. Sixto was in foster care in Bridgeport, knew he had to get out of there, somehow got himself to college by hook or by crook, really. I mean, it's incredibly rare for foster kids to actually graduate with a 4-year degree. And Sixto has not, in fact, graduated. But while in college, he started this nonprofit called Think of Us, which is specifically for older foster youth. So he is all about elevating youth voice, which is
Yes.
what you're asking about here, and helping young people advocate for themselves, and in fact bringing young people into whatever kinds of redesign of foster care may be going on. I mean, he's adamant about that. He created this new kind of think tank called the Center for Lived Experience. I have that right? So I guess I would say this is happening. An activist like Sixto Cancel is at the forefront of making it happen more, but he's hardly the only person. These opportunities are out there more and more, but I guess I would just say for young people who are interested in talking about their experience, which is really, really important for policymakers to understand and really hear, to know that there's this thing where when you cross that line and you're no longer seen as young, I think it's a really cold awakening for a lot of young people. Like, what? Now I'm not as important. It's rough.
The book moved me as I was reading it, and I imagined several times people I've met through my work who have been in foster care. I wanted to hand each person a copy of your book and say, all right, when you talk to your social worker, when you talk to your caseworker, hand them this book and say, look at, she might write a sequel and you don't want to be in that sequel.
I went to some length in the book, and I will say it again. I don't think there's any particular bad guy villains or bad guy social workers or girl social workers or
Mm-hmm.
evil foster
Mm-hmm.
parents. That is not what, I mean, the book is extremely critical of foster care, but not because of bad actors within the system, more about a sort of inertia up on all of our parts and a refusal to confront this system, which is essentially the same system we've had more or less for 100 years. I mean, like, it's not that different, and its outcomes are atrocious, and they've been atrocious for a really long time. It's the structure of the system and how it undermines healthy development of young people, severely undermines healthy development. That's the issue. It's not that this or that social worker or foster parent is a good or bad person. It's kind of beyond any individual people. But you conjured the image of a young person having this book and like, what would they do with it? How could they advocate for themselves? I think there are a couple of pretty interesting, very nascent efforts out there, like in the area of housing stability, housing stipends, so that fewer young people exiting foster care go right into homelessness, which is thousands of kids every year. Also, universal basic income is, again, kind of a project happening in certain jurisdictions in California,
Mm-hmm.
where young people leaving foster care are given a small amount of income just to help get them on their feet while they are also presumably working or doing something. From what I understand, those efforts are showing some promising results. So I would say any way that a young person can sort of get educated about those things and maybe even get hooked up with those things and then advocate for more of those things, those would be two areas I would look at: housing supports and universal basic income, where I think California is leading.
Thank you for pointing it out. There are really no villains in the book, and even the people who you think it might be tilting that way, you have a marvelous ability to bring it back around and show there are multiple sides to the issues they're grappling with. So thank you for clarifying. My question wasn't to denigrate anyone, but I too picture a youth with this book saying to someone, "Look, this is a problem that's bigger than both of us,
Right.
and I don't want to end up in prison. This is my second placement, and I foresee I'm going to have a third and a fourth and a fifth, and I want to know what can I do to help myself to not do that." And that's the sort of seed that your book plants, I think.
So to have that conversation, one of the things I learned in doing the book is so many young people in foster care, for various reasons, not least of which is that they are young,
Yeah.
have a really hard time articulating what you just said. And it's also really hard for social workers who are pressed and overloaded to hear that. But even if a kid were able to say some version of what you just said, part of the problem is that foster care is so impermanent in every way. And you alluded to it in the introduction. Caseworkers, social workers, therapists are just constantly rotating through these kids' lives. A few months here, a few months there. There's very little opportunity to establish and maintain ongoing relationships that last, years. This is how you develop trust, and this is how you're in a position to say that, hey, I don't want to be somebody who ends up incarcerated. How can you help me? That kind of conversation comes with trust, and there's very little when kids, and in fact social workers too, everybody is sort of acculturated to being like, yeah, you're going to come and go, and I'm going to move on, and you're going to move on. And like everybody kind of knows that. And
Yeah.
so, how deep is your relationship really going to go? Obviously, there are exceptions. Obviously, there are brilliant social
Sure.
workers who are able to forge a connection with a kid. But foster care itself is all about don't get too attached because you will be moving on. I mean, it shouldn't be that way, but that is how it has been.
Very well stated. Because we're talking about this great book you've written, I'm wondering if you could favor us with a selection of your choosing.
Okay, So one of the things, this is a very short passage, and I could read more if you want, but I'll start short. One of the things I really wanted to convey in this book, right? So this book is about the crossover between foster care and incarceration and how many kids in foster care end up locked up by the time they are 26. They will have been. They might not be locked up at that point, but at some point during their life, by the time they're 26, 59% of kids in foster care will have experienced some kind of incarceration either during or immediately after. That is a crazy number, and it comes from a very rigorous series of studies out of the Midwest in the early 2000s that checked in on kids after they left foster care to see how they were doing in early adulthood. What are the outcomes, right? So this thing about incarceration and crime, right? So like there were crimes committed. I mean, sometimes kids get locked up, for status crimes, right? For like running away, but also violent crimes are being committed. And I really wanted to understand that mindset. And you alluded to it in the part of the book that you read from the beginning, this understanding that kind of anger, that kind of violence. I really wanted to understand what is driving that impulse in a young person. So in doing the book, I needed to sort of find a way to articulate that and see it in these kids. I encountered a guy who was not a kid at all. He was in his late 50s, and his name is Arthur Longworth. He was doing a life sentence. He had been in foster care in Washington State and was essentially ejected from the system in 1981 when he was 16. Shortly after that, he committed a murder, a really savage murder, and got a life without parole sentence. And that is when I contacted him. He was locked up. While locked up, Longworth, who had a 7th grade education when he went in, had taught himself to write. And he had become a really good writer, a shockingly good writer. And so this is why he became a character in my book, because he could still remember that rage of the young person, because there's a quality in prison that arrests development in some way. You're a little bit frozen where you were when you got locked up sometimes. And yet he had matured in his skills as a writer because he's a middle-aged man who had been trying to improve all these many years. So here's the passage that Art wrote, but that I have it in the book here. If you could feel the conflagration of rage born out of powerlessness and the feeling of worthlessness that is cultivated inside a young person raised by the state, you might begin to understand the problem. Why raising young people in this way, then throwing them out onto the street, makes them incompatible with society. This is what Art wrote in an essay called How to Kill Someone. The title is very much about him as much as his victim. But this articulation of rage was really intriguing to me. It also did another thing, which is important for the book, which is to show, I mean, Art he was a man in his late 50s when I was contacted him. He had done at that point, when I contacted him, I think he had done 35 years.
Yeah.
What it also showed is how long this has been the case, right? Art was able, as a middle-aged man, to speak to the experience of Marianne, who was a teenager in, 2016, 2017, 2018, and Art had been a teenager in the 1980s. It's the same story.
Yes.
It's 40 years later. It's the same story. Like, this is an important thing to see here, policymakers who might be listening.
That's great. Well, Claudia, thank you for that passage. You do not get off the hook, however, because you've read something that Art wrote, and it's great. But one of the things that I found about this book is that your solid reporting and your writing talent, your beautiful way to tell something that's happening in someone's heart or in someone's room really elevates the book, I think, to bestseller status. So
thank you.
You're welcome, and thank you. So if you would kindly turn to page 17 in your workbook.
Yes. Okay.
Just below the ellipses.
Okay, I'm getting there.
It's a long passage, but it's a good one, and it really showcases a lot about your book through to the very first paragraph on page 19. So it's essentially
really
page and a half, 2 pages, but this is what authors do all the time. Go for it.
Okay. All right, here we go. I wasn't thinking about the number of foster kids who wind up in prison as I settled myself in the second row of benches in Judge Ferguson's courtroom for Marianne's sentencing. I wasn't even thinking much about Marianne. A forensic psychologist I knew had been hired to testify for the prosecution on an appropriate punishment. And because I'd been thinking about writing a book on youth crime, he suggested I listen in. Marianne was probably a budding sociopath, he'd told me after interviewing her at the King County Jail. He planned to recommend that Judge Ferguson lock her away for a quarter century. I remembered hearing about Marianne's arrest. I'd been an education reporter at the time, covering racial segregation in Seattle schools and debates over discipline for kindergarteners. But something about her story nagged at me. Something about the tightness in the chief prosecutor's office when he mentioned her as an example of surging youth violence. Cold-blooded, said the headline over Marianne's photograph on one news site. The picture showed her in a car, eyes narrow and hard as she glared at the camera. This was the image I held in my mind as I walked into court. Hello, Marianne grumbled at her state-appointed attorney, Colleen O'Connor, before plopping into a chair at the defense table. She stretched her legs out straight, held them a few inches off the floor, and paddled her feet in the air like flippers. Though she'd spent 3 birthdays in juvenile detention and jail, Marianne, now 19, still looked like a girl, pallid and slight. She had tweezed her eyebrows into delicate bird's wings and twisted her long brown hair into 2 dainty braids like Dorothy from The Wizard of Oz. This persona was calculated, I thought, scribbling impressions in my notebook. Marianne had clearly primped for her appearance, but she hadn't been able to hide the shadow surrounding her eyes. It did not look like sleeplessness so much as something that came from within. Nor has she tried to cover up a $sign tattooed on her neck or the words "fuck love" inked across the back of her right hand. The courtroom was packed with onlookers, its first row crowded with the family and friends of Marianne's victim, many of them dressed in traditional African robes and head wraps. Behind sat a dozen young women from a prostitution survivors group who'd come to support Marianne. All of them wore purple. The color of transformation, one whispered to me. No one from Marianne's various families, biological, foster, or adoptive, was present. The forensic psychologist who'd invited me never testified. Instead, I listened as the prosecutor spent 2 hours arguing that the teenager in front of us should be locked away for 24 years. Marianne rocked gently in her chair. An affectation, I told myself, a show of self-soothing to create sympathy. I'd spent much of my early adulthood trying to understand criminal violence, including 5 years conversing with a serial murderer, and my perceptions of Marianne were filtered through that experience. I viewed everything about her through the prism of the budding child sociopath I'd been warned about. Marianne, showing little reaction to anything being said about her, fit neatly into my assumptions. Only when the prosecutor described her as a remorseless manipulator did Marianne's face betray emotion. Her nostrils flared. A tear trickled down her cheek. It was true, the prosecutor allowed, that this teenager had suffered years of neglect. She had come into the child welfare system as an abused 9-year-old. Even before neighbors' calls to police finally got Marianne taken away from her father, everyone in their small development knew something was wrong. They'd called Marianne's school to report constant screaming in her home. They'd passed food to her through a bedroom window because Marianne was locked inside, alone and hungry. They'd knocked on her father's door, wondering about the sound of something being thrown against the walls, and peered inside to see a child's bedroom with no clothes in the closet, no pictures on the walls, no toys. Marianne's dad thanked them for their concern, but he never introduced his daughter. It was as if she was no one, a neighbor said.
Wow. That is a great passage, and you are a great writer. And that really sort of reveals something about you. You're not really puffing your feathers much in that passage, are you?
Look, I'm asking people to be really honest about some of the most painful parts of their lives. I feel like, good faith here, right? I need to show I'm no saint. I came in with preconceptions. I was guarded. I was suspicious. I was not entirely charitable in my thinking. I had a lot of skepticism coming into this, and I think it's important to own that.
Every chapter leads naturally to the next, and the stories are interwoven. I like how we get to visit people and then go and visit someone else and then return to that person we just met. And we see how their stories, if not their actual selves, connect.
Thank you very
Um,
much. Important to make like a good read. I want readers to, read this because it's a good story. If they learn some things about foster care along the way, that's great. But I really want people to be gripped by the story.
which leads me to ask, other than Marianne's, which of the stories from your book, Arthur, Vera, Sixto, Monique, Tina, Keaty, which one tugs at your heart and head the most these days?
There are many. You didn't mention Jay, and Jay is Jay Perez Torres in New York City. Tugs at my heartstrings because in a book that has some pretty dark aspects, Jay's story is a bit of a ray of light, but not a fake miracle. So it does tug at my heartstrings. Jay was a kid in foster care in New York City in the 20 teens, so like 2015 or so. He was lugging his stuff around New York City in a garbage bag, his clothes, his food, his birth certificate as a middle schooler, because he was sort of bouncing between his father was sort of in and out of prison and itinerant. He was sometimes stayed with a stepmother. He was sort of
Mm.
intermittently homeless. Eventually, the child welfare system, a teacher at middle school called, and he was picked, he was identified by the system. And he had a really rough time. He was gang involved. He was growing up part of the time in a group home. He was really a sad and miserable and angry kid. Did some time in juvie, dropped out of 3 high schools. And so now he's finally at his 4th high school, last chance high school. This is not a kid anybody is thinking is likely to graduate, let alone do anything else. And there's this young woman at this last chance high school in New York City who is practically a kid herself. She's 23 years old. It's her first job out of college. Her assignment is to just get these kids over the line to graduation. Do whatever it takes, get them their diploma. That's her job. And so she's looking for this kid Jay. She needs him to come to her office to like do her intake. They finally meet. He kind of unloads all this stuff on her about his life. She is so totally unequal to it. She is a kid. She is untrained. She doesn't have like a psych degree, nothing. And all this stuff is coming out of him. They connect. It's not some magic miracle. It's just like every day or every couple days a week in her office, he checks in. She helps him find new routes to school because he's always worried about a different gang set going to jump him. They bonded even in the 9 months that he was at this one last school. And she goes, you're pretty smart and your test scores are really good, especially since you never go to school. I think we can do better for you. I think we can get you to college. This is a kid who was like dropped out of 3 high schools, right? Well, okay. About a month ago, I watched Jay earn his doctorate. He is now a PhD. And he pegs the turnaround to that moment with her, this 23-year-old graduation advocate at his last chance high school. This is the power of connection. This is the power of a human connection that can make a difference for people. That tugs at my heartstrings.
Monique tugged at mine.
That is a brutal story. I would say Monique's is the toughest story in the book.
So any reader who picks up this book is going to ride a little bit of a roller coaster of emotion and is going to come out better for it. I think so, because of the way you have crafted it. One character I strongly identified with, I'd love you to talk a little bit more about, is Judge Ernestine Gray, please. Yeah.
Okay, Judge Ernestine Gray, she is tough. Was a judge in juvenile court in New Orleans for decades. And she saw the same thing. She was seeing it way back since the 80s and then even more in the 90s. And then she really got the same thing that I finally saw when I figured it all out. Like, whoa, all these kids are coming into the system that says we can do better than your family. We can do better than your biological parents. We're the state, and we're gonna do better. You're in a bad situation. And yet the outcomes are what I just said, 59% getting locked up, like at least 30% exiting, into homelessness. In New Orleans, even worse than that in many cases. So Judge Ernestine Gray, who is an African-American woman born and raised in segregated South Carolina, sees these outcomes, notices that like 99% of the kids coming to her court are Black, even though there are plenty of white kids in New Orleans getting left at daycare, like, and their parents don't show up or they don't seem to have enough food. But somehow it's only Black kids are being petitioned for removal by the state.
Yeah.
This is what Judge Gray notices. And then she notices the outcomes for kids and feels like, hey, I'm part of a system that is maybe not doing it a good thing, or not doing a well-intended thing well. She's starting to feel increasingly uncomfortable about her role in this system as kind of a rubber stamp along the way to foster care. So she starts implementing the law to the letter of the law rather than just sort of acting as, like I said, kind of a way station on this journey into foster care, kind of a part of an assembly line. She starts saying, hey, I'm going to do, in fact, what the statute says, which is you have to have tried to help a family before you remove a child. You have to have tried to provide services. You have to look for a relative placement before a stranger. Like, you have to do all these things. You have to prove that the child is truly in danger, not just in a lousy situation. It has to literally be what the law says. And that in itself was revolutionary for her jurisdiction, New Orleans. In implementing the letter of the law with that kind of fidelity, she almost ended foster care in New Orleans. Like, this is, yes, good, but also controversial, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
sure.
New Orleans had, at the time, they're like, it's a city of 400,000 people, 75,000 kids, and there were like less than 30 children in long-term foster care. I mean, she essentially closed the door. What she did do was turn many children over to their relatives. If they had to be removed from a biological parent, she was turning them over to their relatives. This is more and more what we call kinship care now.
Yeah.
It is like a newer leading edge of what you would call kind of a reform in foster care, which is placing children with people they know rather than strangers. The reform is giving those people state stipends, supports, just like a foster parent would get. So Judge Gray essentially was taking kids who couldn't live at home. She was saying, okay, live with kin, right, with a relative. And she was doing it before kinship care kind of became like the word of the day for a better road. Super controversial. Not everybody loves Judge Ernestine Gray, but she did something that showed, hey, maybe there are too many kids in foster care, certainly in New Orleans. She essentially closed the door, and yet there were not more kids being reported for abuse, right? They did not seem to have a bad outcome in terms of more child injury, more child death being left in their biological homes or with their relatives. Were they in neglectful situations? Possibly, because who knows? The book was closed, right? But they didn't come back into foster care. They weren't re-reported for abuse or neglect. That was her indicator that what she was doing was righteous in some way.
And you don't give her a free pass. You certainly hold her what she did up to scrutiny through the words of other people. And still, I came away with the idea that she's onto something.
She's
And
onto something,
and the
for
fact
sure.
that when she retired, she had to retire aged out. The numbers slowly crept back up.
Yes, and I just read an article today that says they are way back up in Louisiana. I don't know about New Orleans Parish, but I know they are going back up. Yes, her
Yeah.
reforms or her approach was not widely adopted after she retired.
You touched on the shroud of secrecy. It seems to me that if there's anything that comes out of your book, it might be that for the sake of the children, we can't talk about this. We must seal their records. And while there's some merit to that, obviously, there's also some merit to have a little sunshine on this process, right?
Yeah, I'm really glad that you brought this up. This thing about protecting what the state says, they're minors, right? Kids in foster care are minors. So we're protecting their confidentiality, protecting their privacy. But I will tell you that what that really does is prevent scrutiny, in particular from media, right? Shares a lot of blame here in the way child welfare has been covered in this country. But that kind of supposed veil of confidentiality really, in fact, protects the state. It's not really protecting the kids because look at their outcomes. They're not doing well. Even those who aren't locked up or homeless afterward are underemployed, high rates of poverty, addiction, mental health problems. I mean, these kids are not doing well when they age into adulthood out of foster care. So, this shroud of secrecy thing, the other part about it, besides preventing scrutiny and, in fact, protecting the state, it sort of implies like there's like a secret here, like there's something to be ashamed of. There's an aspect of, oh, we don't say that child is in foster care, like as if what is it something to hide? I
Right.
don't know. I find that very strange because I'll tell you, every person who spoke to me for this book was dying to talk to somebody who would listen to their story and had wanted to speak about it since they were kids, little kids. I mean, I don't know. I get it about minors and confidentiality and words being manipulated by media. I get it. It's true. These are dangers, but really, let's look here at who has been protected and who has been hurt.
We're seeing now parents are being charged for the actions that their kids take with their weapons. You make a good point that there's a double-edged sword in what the state will accept as the parental stand-in and what they will gladly slough off.
Exactly. I mean, the state is in loco parentis. The state says, I am your parent. And your point is really well taken. Yes, gradually, here and there, some parents are beginning to be prosecuted by the violent crimes committed by their children. But the state, if a kid that the state is parenting, a foster youth, is on the run, not in their placement, when they do something, the state is not responsible for
Right.
anything that they do or anything that happens to them. I mean, I can see from a lawyer's perspective that I get it. Like, how can the state be responsible if they're not where the state put them? Right. I get that. But still, it is quite interesting. You know, a lot of kids run from placement, and that's a lot of instances where the state is not responsible for anything that happens to them or anything they do.
Do you think it'll ever become a beat like violent crime or courts or
You know, that's a great question. I used to work at a newspaper called the Seattle Post-Intelligencer, no longer exists. And we did cover foster care and child welfare as a beat, not in a way I would call the most enlightened, but we did cover it as a beat. It got some ink, it got some real estate, as we say, on the page. That is, you know, less and less. I mean, yes, I think child welfare has to be a beat. I'm really glad you asked me this question. It really irks me as a longtime journalist. I'm really very exasperated and, more than that, angry really at how little attention is given to the $30 billion foster care and child welfare system, $30 billion a year. And we only write about it really as a rule when, you know, like some disaster happens to some very young child, but we don't cover it in an ongoing systemic and policy. What, you know, what are the policies, what are the budgets? It's very scattershot, and it's pretty much entirely driven by disaster, sort of like crisis reporting, which is just not, it's just not it. It's not what we need.
before I ask my last question of this part, which is on a lighter vein, is there a question I haven't asked or a topic we haven't talked about that you think is important regarding your book?
No, your questions are great. You're really getting to some stuff I want to talk about, so I appreciate that.
Okay. Nothing you can think of that we haven't talked about. You think,
Well, we've talked, I mean, yes, of course, there are a million things we haven't talked about, but you are getting to things that not everybody asks me. So I'm glad for the chance to talk about, for instance, media's responsibility or irresponsibility and other such things. Yeah.
sure, sure. In my researching you, Ms. Rowe, I came upon a delightful travelogue you wrote in 2003, leaving New York for Washington State, driving cross country by yourself in your VW. Just wonderful little vignettes, people you ran into, people you stayed with, an epiphany moment in Glacier National Park. When you think about it, a good foster care situation, a good adoption is all about a fresh start from a horrible situation or a bad situation or untenable situation to a fresh start. And you have experienced, you did for yourself a fresh start. Could you talk a little bit about your fresh start and what a fresh start can do for someone if they're willing to take it?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I did do that. I did need to break away from the East Coast. I did need to leave a lot of the past in the past. I had this internal conviction that where I was from was holding me down, kind of strangling me in some way psychologically. And I will tell you that when I said, "Well, I'm going to the West Coast," and I did not have a job. I did not know a soul. I knew no one. I had no job. All I had was a place that I could sublet for 3 months. That's what I had.
Wow.
And I will tell you, people were not supportive. People who were in my life, who purportedly care about me and who I would consider intelligent people. One of them said, "Hey, wherever you go, there you are." Basically saying, "You're going to bring your problems with you. And so, good luck to you, but you're running and you're going to have your same problems wherever you are." I get that. I think there's something to that, of course. But I had this internal, like, deep belief over years, built over years that I had to make a change. I had to have a fresh start. And I did do that, and I was right. I landed in Washington State and never looked back. I mean, it was a good change. It was a good thing to do. What can a fresh start do? Well, for sure, the West is about reinvention, right? I mean, and even Seattle itself, which is where I live, it is a city of reinvention. It is a city that has tradition. I didn't know this, of course, when I landed here, but in later years,
Yeah.
it is a city that has welcomed sort of entrepreneurial types who are like, "I don't care what the rules say. I'm going to do it my way. I'm going to do it for myself. I'm going to do it on my own." I did not know all of that when I landed here, but that kind of was true for me. And the West is full of reinvention, full of people trying to make a change. So I feel like I kind of landed in a place where that was not seen as strange or questionable in any way, but in fact logical.
The courses that I offer people are big on past is not prologue. No matter how lousy you've had it, you're in control of a lot more than you're giving yourself credit for. And your story and the way you wrote it really spoke to that, and especially your moment when you got to drive the road to the sun, which now you have to get tickets for.
Oh man, that was a pivotal life moment. It was incredible. That was incredible. A lot of people said, "Oh, you're a woman in your 30s driving alone. You better bring pepper spray. You're at risk." All the stuff, right? Nothing bad happened. It was the greatest
Yeah.
thing. It was great. It was like one of the greatest things I ever did.
That's a sort of moxie that I would like to impart on people who feel like because their dad was an alcoholic and their grandfather was an alcoholic and their great great grandmother was an alcoholic that they're gonna be an alcoholic and this life doesn't have much for them anymore and they're young. The courage to pick a destination and go reinvent yourself is something that I think is in our blood as Americans and is entirely possible, way more possible than people think. So thank you for that.
Totally echo what you're saying. And by the way, reinvention is not hiding from the past. It is not pretending the past doesn't exist. It is not lying about the past. It is saying, I'm making a break, I'm taking a new road. It's two different things.
Well, as you know, as we agreed, there are two parts to this particular podcast, and the second part has each of us share a quote or a passage that we find meaningful or compelling and discuss it. Who would you like to go first?
You.
All righty. I was listening to a baseball game and there was an ad on. This is while I'm thinking about my Claudia Rowe interview. There's an ad came on for adoptuskids.org. It's a clearinghouse, really. And I was skeptical going in, but once I started diving into the site, there's a tremendous amount of resources, and they really focus on teen adoptions. They have a podcast where I listened to the third episode. It's called Navigating Adoption, and episode 3 was entitled You Are Not Alone, wherein they interviewed two women, and they each had a quote that I pulled out of this podcast. Mary Boo, who's the executive director at the Council on Adoptable Children, said, "The birth family is the reason this child exists. This child doesn't exist without that family. If you don't embrace that and the child doesn't hear you embracing that, they may feel that you don't value them. I can't say enough that you need to acknowledge all parts of the child, and that includes their birth family."
Yes.
Thought I'd get an amen on that. And the second one, Melinda Liss, who's the vice president at Spalding for Children, said, "I would have 3 pieces of advice for parents who are starting this journey. 1, attachment is the most important thing, more important than anything else. Grades, sports, outcomes, but having that relationship and attachment is essential. 2, redefine your definition of family. Make it expansive versus narrow. And 3, always be honest and truthful with your child about what you know and don't know, the mistakes that you make along the way, and how you can work together to move forward."
Well, as you know, this thing about attachment, there's quite a bit about that
Yes.
in my book. So yes, I mean, it's so foundational, and not just because it's nicer, because it has actual chemical repercussions in human brains.
Yes.
That attachment affects hormones, stress hormones, cortisol in particular. And when that is out of whack, it has effects in behavior. I mean, this attachment thing is so important. And foster care, I mean, we didn't know that for most of the history of foster care. We did not know that. But now we do know that. And we have
Yes.
not retooled foster care to take that into account.
Which is why I thought it was remarkable that the head of the North American Council on Adoptable Children is now saying, don't forget, don't ignore, don't not mention the birth family, which
This is really,
that was
really new.
policy.
Like really new. This is the leading edge of everybody beginning to say, oh, wow, we have been doing it wrong, because nobody can deny the outcomes. This is not fringe lefty in Seattle's interpretation. I mean, these are right? This is like tons of reports. This is like, there's research from an MIT economist in the book, and the National Academies of Science, and Chapin Hall, which is this massive child welfare think tank at the University of Chicago. This is like pretty reputable, sober-minded people all saying the same thing.
Well, your book awakened me to that. And so thank you for listening to my quotes. What do you got?
Well, happily and fantastically, I think my one little quote lines up right with what you said. And it's also in the book, and it is near the beginning of the book. And it is this: behavior is a language. And it is a middle school teacher who said that to me some years ago when I was, as I mentioned, reporting intensively on education. And this was a reporting on school discipline and misbehavior in schools. And this was a teacher who said, just understand, behavior is a language. And it just lodged in my mind. And it's this language that we, the adults, need to decipher. We need to listen better. We need to translate it better. We need to hear this language better instead of just reacting to the behavior that we're seeing. We need to understand what it is saying. This is this whole thing I was trying to get at the beginning, where like there's all this violent crime or acting out or problematic behavior from so many kids who have been through foster care and juvenile justice systems. And there's another character in the book, Jennifer Rodriguez, a former foster youth, now attorney in California, who said something very similar to me. And it is essentially that when kids act the worst is when they need help the most, right? When kids push away, when they seem really hostile, aggressive, frightening, impossible to reach, this is a sign, this is a language, this is saying something is really wrong, something is really hurt, right? I mean,
Yes.
a very, very smart person once observed to me that anger is a reflection of the depth of sadness, that the intensity of a person's anger is a reflection of the depth of their sadness. There's something to that in this thing about behavior and about understanding that really problematic, challenging behavior is something more than that. It is not only aggressive and hostile, it is speaking to something else as well. We need to hear that.
Words of the State, The Long Shadow of American Foster Care was just published on May 20th by Abrams Press of New York. It is available on Kindle for $14.99, on Amazon and in hardcover for $28, wherever great, well-written, insightful books that matter are sold. Claudia Rowe is the recipient of a Casey Medal for meritorious journalism and multiple honors for investigative reporting. Her work has been twice nominated for the Pulitzer Prize in Journalism. Claudia has been published in the New York Times, Mother Jones, and the Seattle Times, among others, where at the Seattle Times she is a member of its editorial board. In 2018, Claudia's memoir, The Spider and the Fly, won the Washington State Book Award. For more on this talented and prolific teller of truths, you may visit ClaudiaRoweJournalist.com and learn about her other books and to read some of her most compelling reporting. Claudia, thank you so much for making time to be on the Stay Free Forever podcast.
Thank you for this fantastic conversation. I have really enjoyed it.
The Stay Free Forever podcast is recorded and produced by Clifford Fuel, owner of Stay Free Forever, LLC, a Colorado and Wyoming company. Stay Free Forever provides adult and youth life skills courses via both e-learning and mailed workbooks, plus Zoom classes for any age group. Our theme music was composed and performed by James Benjamin Fuel. Editing and